We are all familiar with the gargantuan size that modern governments have ballooned to. Totalitarianism is on everyone's lips. We fear a state so total that it can control every aspect of our lives. We fear government power because government power means an end, ultimately, to our autonomy, if not to our existence as humans. But why are modern governments so powerful? Why are they capable of mass surveillance or social credit systems? Foucault, in his lecture on Governmentality, answers this question. I will explain his position and then explore the link between governmentality and technocracy, as well as end with a discussion on social liberties. As Foucault states, the rise in the power and omnipresence of the state owes not so much to its expansion nor territorialization, but rather to a change in the focus and definition of government. Originally, a government was conceived of as a problem of sovereignty, which was essentially a problem of law. Government consisted of the enforcement and establishment of laws, as well as the regulation of what was considered as economy at the time. Economy, according to a 16th century writing, meant the regulation of familial wealth and well-being. Government was constrained by this model conception by which it viewed the family's prosperity as the end of the government. Eventually, what Foucault calls the art of government would begin to take shape. The two constraints on government, the focus on the problem of sovereignty and law, and the family as a model, became supplanted by the emergence of the population, as well as the technique of statistics. No longer was the model or end of government the family and its economy to be regulated with laws, but rather the end became population and the tactics used upon it. In other words, government became a matter of technique. In the modern world, we have borne witness to the emergence of an elite technocracy, beginning perhaps with the eugenics of the turn of the last century, following through the Soviet Union, and culminating in the discourse and political machinery of the Fourth Industrial Revolution. The notion of politics as a technique for the ordering and modification and even the surveillance of the masses is a product not of globalization itself, as is the common theory, but rather it owes to the development of this governmentality. For Foucault, governmentality is the transformation of the object of government from the question of sovereignty and family, as it was for Machiavelli and his contemporaries, into the practice of techniques on the population, as well as the field of what we today call economics. According to Foucault, governmentality consists of three aspects. 1. The ensemble formed by the institutions, procedures, analyses, and reflections, the calculations and tactics that allow the exercise of this very specific, albeit complex form of power, which has as its target population, as its principal form of knowledge, political economy, and as its essential technical means, apparatuses of security. 2. The tendency that, over a long period and throughout the West, has gradually led toward the preeminence over all other forms, sovereignty, discipline, and so on, of this type of power, which may be termed government, resulting on one hand in the formation of a whole series of specific governmental apparatuses, and on the other in the development of a whole complex of knowledges. 3. The process, or rather the result of the process, through which the state of justice in the Middle Ages transformed into the administrative state during the 15th and 16th century, and gradually became governmentalized. The consequence of governmentality is that regulation of behavior is no longer an interpersonal task. Instead, it is a concern in the domain of the population as a whole. Where regulation of behavior was once a task of the family, then later the police, now it is the task of the government directly to surveil and correct the population as a whole. Policing is inadequate to control large populations, so a state that is sufficiently governmentalized would, under a mass surveillance program, employ the technique of social credit based on digital IDs. Now that men are subjects in a population, their efficacy and obedience is more important than ever before. Thus, the possibility of mainstreaming transhuman technology becomes available. The consequence of this realization that technocracy is caused by governmentality is that simply reducing the size of the government is not an effective solution for reducing its power. It may not be possible right now, but what ultimately must be done is to change the very nature of government. We must return to making the validity of government actions contingent upon a conditional sovereignty. We must return to the family as the origin point for the structure of government, and we must cease thinking in terms of masses and instead consider people as part of organic collectivities, such as, again, the family, and ultimately we must return to viewing people as persons rather than as individuals or collectives. It's salient that economy meant in the past the interrelation of the family with things. Now the word economy simply refers to a heterogeneous mass of commercial transactions and activities. The well-being of actual humans and the ability for families to even subsist is no longer the concern of government interventions in the economy, as is proved currently by Trump's pointless tariffs, as well as the government's importation of foreigners, which depresses already stagnant wages, which is, by the way, continuing under Trump and the H-1B visa program. Companies are allowed to underpay workers and pocket the profits for the sake of the efficiency of the economy as a mass of transactions. When we consider the problem as the economy of families, rather than reducing it down to the GDP or the price of Dow, it becomes quite clear that this is an injustice and the wrong way to view things. What has characterized the 20th and 21st centuries is the excision of the human from society. This is evident enough in the realm of technology, where AI has become convincing enough to replace human artists. Politically, humans have been replaced by populations, and is it any crime if a population is forced into transhuman modifications or mass surveillance? Is it any crime if a population is replaced demographically? But when we consider the autonomous and unique human being, as well as the organic bonds he forms, such as to a family or to a race, we intuitively grasp that it is wrong to treat him like a fungible unit or a member of a mass. Governmentality, as well as technocracy, is the replacement of persons and laws by techniques. Jacques Ellul had a thesis about technique, that the end of technique is the technological replacement of humans. What we see in governmentality is a kind of political replacement that proves this thesis correct, that technique, wherever it becomes implemented, leads to the eradication of human beings through standardization and homogenization. The cost of the death of a human being, not just as an individual, but as a person, is not just existential, but also in itself political. Liberty is highly valued by most people, and it has always been a present virtue in Western society. Even a society as regimented and disciplinarian as Rome had a wide degree of social liberty. To such an extent, it was seen as an empire of evil and sin by contemporary Christians and Jews. The relative distance of the governed from their government in the Middle Ages meant that the average person had a reasonable degree of autonomy and liberty. Despite the protestations of the clergy, it was common for the masses to engage in premarital sex and adultery, and brothels were open in every major city. The situation today, however, is quite dire, as autonomy is under attack both by the left and the right. In the past, vice was a personal matter, not a disease of the population. Today, however, vice and moral wrongdoing is problematized at the population level and typically communicated using the language of disease. This occurs again both on the left and the right. Racism is an epidemic of hate. Porn is an epidemic of vice. Various avenues of human freedom, such as the right to sexual expression, as well as the right of free association, both come under attack as a result of governmentality. As a man of the right, it pains me to see conservatives who ostensibly love liberty and freedom acquiesce to and sometimes even demand restrictions on social liberties that bear almost no weight on prevailing political questions. What was previously personal has now become public, thanks to governmentality, and the double consciousness of the conservative that leftists so often criticize. Small government but tough social controls has led to a situation where the right has become an advocate for the worst forms of boorish bourgeois morality, a kind of morality that is not and never was traditional. In one sense, this is a counterpart to the left's reaction against right-wing radicalism and white racial consciousness. It's almost a defense posed by the left overturning public norms, forcing an equally public and wide-reaching authoritarian response. But simultaneously, this is an overreaction. The answer to governmentality is not more governmentality. The answer is to once again constrain the government to questions of law and sovereignty, to keep it away from interfering with the mass collective of the population. As men of the right, maybe it's not feasible right now, but we should ultimately want a government that does not resort to apparatuses of security to govern. We want liberty. We want autonomy. And as a result, We should be against the further employment of governmentality and generally more skeptical of the prevailing conception of government. We should ask questions about the assumptions we make. Is it right to reduce humans to populations and masses, ignoring the complicated bonds between persons? Is it right that we enmesh questions of government in technical specificities? Should government be a moral discipline rather than a science? These are questions we need to start asking rather than taking the status quo for granted.